Okay, I think we can get started now. So again, greetings to you from UNODC headquarters here in Vienna. And we welcome you all to this discussion, which is exploring the nexus between climate change, trafficking in persons, and smuggling of migrants. My name is Samantha Monodawafa. I'm with the Human Trafficking and Migrant Smuggling section, where I work for the GLOW Act project as the policy lead. We have today a distinguished panel of well-respected voices in this emerging topic, which is increasingly getting a lot of attention on global platforms. And I will introduce each one of them just before I speak. But first, let's just get a few administrative issues out of the way. Please note that the event is recorded. And then can I also ask that we all mute our microphones? And also, because of the limited time we have, considering the main CCPCJ event that is happening, would like to just let presenters know we'll have to be a little bit strict with the timekeeping to make sure we manage to cover everything and possibly have time for a discussion after that. We also encourage anyone who has questions to post them on the chat as we go along. Just in case, we don't get a chance at the end of the session to have everyone ask. So please do feel free to post on the chat. But let's begin by giving the floor to the Chief of UNODC's Human Trafficking and Migrant Smuggling section, Mr. Elias Khatzik, to deliver some welcoming remarks. Elias, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Samantha. And hello from my side as well. I would like to thank you all for being with us today, especially our distinguished panelists. We're very happy to kickstart the debate about how climate change, environmental degradation, also natural disasters that are due to climate change affect the crimes that we're talking. We're dealing with trafficking in persons and the smuggling of migrants. This is a discussion that has only recently started, and I think we're all trying to understand how these changes, intersect with the crimes and how, they're increasing the vulnerability of people, especially trafficking in persons. And in my view, there are actually two elements that are worth mentioning here, and which could be helpful in the discussion that will follow. The first one is the effect that climate change and the other aspects that I mentioned have on forced displacement, on forcing people to move from their homes that they had for years, for decades, for centuries, trying to move another location where they could feed their families. How this makes them more vulnerable to smugglers and how that makes them more vulnerable also to serious types of exploitation such as human trafficking. And the UN has started taking notice of this effect for some years now. And there are a number of resolutions which make specific reference to the effects of climate change or forced displacement. One of the most relevant ones for our discussion here is, of course, the Global Compact on Migration, which has a specific commitment under Objective 2 for member states, which recognizes that natural disasters, the adverse effects of climate change and environmental degradation are drivers compelling people to leave their countries of origin. The UN has set up a migration network to help member states implement the Global Compact, and the migration network has now a new stream of work that will look at the intersection between climate change, a work stream as we call it, between climate change and migration. I would like to remind also our audience that the member states will be reviewing the commitments and the implementation of the Global Compact in May this year. So that would be a very good opportunity to take stock of the progress in the implementation of the objectives and also to raise these issues in the group of countries. Now, the second area where I think there's also an important intersection is in the industries that are, in accordance with the data, more, how can I say, more, we record more cases of trafficking for forced labor, such as, for example, the textile industry, agriculture, construction, mining, logging, sea fishing. And these are actually among the industries that are also recorded as among those that lead to environmental degradation and contributing to climate change. So we actually think that action against trafficking, I'm sorry, environmental change and the impact that these industries have could also, and the regulation of these industries could have a very positive effect on labor abuses and those rules that protect workers in these industries. So I would like, these are just my initial thoughts. I'm very happy that we're having this discussion today. I'm very looking forward to the panelists' contributions. I just wanted to contribute these initial thoughts for the discussion, and I'm looking forward to also what our audience would like to contribute to this event today. So thank you very much for being with us, and back to you. Thank you, Samantha. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Elias, for that good background information on what the UN is doing and what is in place in terms of the main global instruments we have at the moment. I'd like now to introduce our first speaker, who is Ms. Siobhan Mulali. She wears many hats. She's the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Trafficking in Persons. She is an established professor of human rights law and director of the Irish Centre for Human Rights at the School of Law, National University of Ireland, Galway. She's a member of the Permanent Court of Arbitration in The Hague, Netherlands, and also joint editor-in-chief of the Irish Yearbook of International Law. Prior to this, she was a member of GRETA, which is the Council of Europe's group of experts against trafficking in persons, where she was elected as vice president and then president in 2016 to 2018. She has worked with many international NGOs and UN agencies in different parts of the world. She has received numerous research awards for work relating to gender equality, migration, refugee protection, human trafficking, and around migrant workers. She was also the commissioner of the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission in 2014 to 2019. She has a big research footprint in numerous leading journals dealing with thematic areas of human rights, gender, migration, child rights, just to name a few. Previously, she held a full professorship in law at the University College Cork, where she was also director of the Centre for Criminal Justice and Human Rights. And before that, she served as chairperson of the Irish Refugee Council. She holds a PhD from the European University Institute, Florence, and LLM from the London School of Economics, and BCL from the University College Cork. Professor Mulali, welcome. We are currently looking forward to a report being developed by your office, by the Special Rapporteur, on the nexus between trafficking in persons and climate change. So we just wanted to find out from you why you chose to prioritize the nexus between trafficking in persons and climate change as the focus of your report. Professor Mulali, over to you.
I have poor network. I'm going to leave my video off if that's okay. I'm delighted to be part of this side event and this panel. Environmental degradation. Decided to focus my report this year to the General Assembly on this topic because we know that responses to climate change and to environmental degradation today, most part, neglected the legal and human rights issues arising in relation to trafficking in persons. And we see similar gaps as we have seen in the past in relation to policy failures in responding to natural disasters, to conflict settings and humanitarian settings, where the risks of trafficking in persons are not always recognised as they should be. And while we see increasing attention to sexual and gender-based violence, human rights violations against children, the consequence of that is that victims of trafficking do not get the assistance and protection that they need and is their right. Also, prevention programming is weak, and there is a lack of accountability. So traffickers can continue to operate with impunity in these settings. As Ilias said, we also know that the climate crisis is already leading to forced displacement and migration. And this year, with the upcoming International Migration Review Forum in May, looking at the implementation of the Global Compact on Migration, we have a critical opportunity where states can recognise and respond to the climate crisis while also addressing increased risks of trafficking in persons arising from forced displacement and migration. So this is critical to look at these intersections between Objective 2 and Objective 10 of the Global Compact. And thirdly and finally, what I would say, and again, this was already mentioned, as Ilya said, there are certain sectors that are contributing particularly to environmental degradation. Intensive agriculture, extractive mining, fisheries. These are also sectors where we see a high incidence of trafficking for forced labour. And linked to that, there's a particular problem in that groups that are at a high risk of trafficking in persons are also particularly affected by the climate crisis. Refugee migrant workers. So again, recognising these connections, I think, is critically important at this juncture, so that when we talk about the climate crisis, we're also talking about climate.
I don't know if it's just on my side, but it seems you're cutting off a little bit. Zoe, are you hearing? Is it just me or? Yeah. Okay, so I don't know if we should, maybe you could, if we can get you back, Prof. Mulali, and maybe you could also add for us, you know, from the work you've done so far towards the report, if there's any preliminary insights that are coming up that you might want to share. Hopefully we will be able to hear hear you a bit better as well. The audio was not very clear from my side.
Okay, thank you. The preliminary findings, yes, as I said, those groups that are often most negatively impacted by climate change are also those that are at high risk of trafficking for purposes of forced labour in contexts of displacement and conflict. So Indigenous peoples, for example, refugees, migrant workers in irregular situations, families, women and girls in particular. So this is something that I want to highlight, the racial justice element, the requirements of assistance and protection and prevention without discrimination. Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you very much for that, Prof. Mulali. The points are really taken and noted. I'd like now to introduce our second panelist, who's Dr. Ritu Bharadwaj. She's a senior researcher in the climate change team of the International Institute for Environment and Development, IIED, in the United Kingdom. She has more than 18 years of senior policy she has more than 18 years of experience in policy development, research, management in government, with funding agencies and with international NGOs. She has worked extensively on climate resilience, resource conservation, social protection, migration, and gender issues. And over the years, her work has helped develop robust evidence-based research that has influenced policy frameworks and strategies for many organizations and governments. Her experience spans across issues of climate change, disaster reduction, and migration, and how it interacts with climate-induced migration. She has particular understanding on how to align development and social protection programs to prevent climate-induced displacement and distress migration. Having provided leadership on policy and program design, she is seen as an important resource in the think tank of several institutions, particularly with government agencies, where she has contributed to the overall strategy, learning, and advocacy agendas. Dr. Ritu, it's so good to have you today. Could you please describe the links between human trafficking, migration, and climate change, just to break it down for us, please? Yeah.
Thank you so much, Samantha. And firstly, I would say it really feels good to be part of this event and see this issue getting the recognition it needs. Because I remember when we started exploring and researching this issue, it wasn't being talked much about. So, and we really need to move this discussion on climate change and trafficking nexus from the sidelines to the center stage of the policy discourse and action. And events like this would really help in bringing it to prominence. So thanks for organizing this event. And now going to your question, Our research and evidence indicated that the nexus between climate change, migration, and trafficking, it exists along three pathways. And especially the first context in which we saw that nexus existing was in case of sudden and extreme climatic events, such as cyclones, floods, and hurricanes, which leads to forced displacement of communities. And we saw very strong evidence exist indicating that human trafficking increases in the aftermath of such events. There were many evidence out there, especially if I can quote some examples. In Bangladesh, women who were left widowed by Cyclone Sidr were targeted by traffickers and driven into prostitution and hard labor. Similarly, following the annual floods in Assam in Northeast India, women and girls were forced into child slavery or forced marriages to make their ends meet. So this is the first pathway in which we saw this nexus existing. The second pathway, we are saying, so what we're trying to explain is that this nexus not just exists in case of sudden displacement. The second pathway indicated that it also exists in case of slow onset events like drought and desertification or salination or sea level rise, which leads to crop loss, drinking water crisis, food insecurity. And this situation pushes communities dependent on natural resources for their survival and livelihood. They start pursuing this risky coping mechanism or risky migration pathways. And research, we have ample number of case studies, for example, from Chitraput in India, or in Cambodia, Blood Bricks is another research which has really mapped the intricate details of how farmers whose livelihood had been undermined by climate change were forced into intergenerational bondage and trafficking-like situation. The third pathway where we saw this nexus existing was when climate impacts then is combined with conflict and forced displacement. And this final pathway normally exists when forced displacement due to conflict is further precipitated by climatic events. For example, drought, which leads to famine. And while I've explained these three pathways, I don't say that they exist in isolation. They can interact and they can overlap. And in each of these circumstances, we saw that almost similar dynamics drives vulnerability to trafficking. Firstly, climate change worsens poverty and inequality, placing people who are already in precarious situation in positions where they reach their limits of their coping capacity or reach the tipping point, and then they are exposed to vulnerability of trafficking. And second is when vulnerability to climate-induced migration is more, it impacts those who are already marginalized. For example, the special rapporteur was just mentioning on the issue, those who are already marginalized by gender, sex, ethnicity, or socioeconomic status, they are the ones who are most exposed to the vulnerability of trafficking when they are displaced or pushed into a situation of distress migration. And the problem is there is absence of a strong policy environment that can help in dealing with this issue. So, that in a nutshell is the way in which we saw climate migration, climate-induced distress displacement, impacting vulnerability or creating vulnerability to trafficking and modern slavery.
Okay, great. Thank you very much for that. So what key messages or action points would you like the global community to take away on this issue?
I would really say that, policymakers need to work out targeted action right from the international level, national level, down to the local level. And I will just explain a few targeted actions that is needed right now. Firstly, we need to recognize this as a priority, both for development as well as climate policy, and integrate these priorities in climate resilience plans, in migration response plan, as well as national development plan. Second, I would say they should be, and because I come from a climate background, and I will be proposing more actions that we need from that point of view as well, because we do need to understand that climate is a stress multiplier. So that's at the heart of all these issues. So second, I would say we need firm targets and actions within the UNFCCC mechanism, similar to the lines of Sustainable Development Goals. Now, we know that there's a task force on displacement, TFD, which has been created in line with Paris Agreement. And what we need for this task force is to recognize this nexus and include that in their action plan so that it can be considered within UNFCCC. Third, I would say, is that there's a need for a more coordinated international effort, but it should be rooted in the existing initiatives. We have heard like there are umpteen number of organizations, prominent international organizations like ILO, yourself, UN organizations, which are working on these issues. But along with that, we also have several initiatives like I just talked about task force on displacement, there's sustainable development goal and action plans around them. There's a Sendai framework around disasters. There's a Nansen initiative. There's a platform on displacement. I can keep going on. And each of them deal with this issue they deal with this issue, but on specific parts of this issue and not in a holistic fashion. What we need is a more joined up and an inclusive approach that complements and draws upon the work of these existing bodies and expert groups. Fourth, I would say we need a more integrated, we need to integrate trafficking and migration in the NDCs, the nationally determined contribution plans that the country make and submit to UNFCCC for action that they are going to take on climate change. Within those NDC plans, we need this issue to be prominently recognized because climate is playing a big role there. And we need to identify policies and actions that countries are going to take to provide safe migration pathway, whether it needs regional collaboration between countries when there's a displacement across the borders. And to implement these action plans or NDC plans, countries should be seeking climate finance along with the other development finance which is available to them. Fifth, I would say, and that's more action at the local level, would be to develop and, we already have so many social safety net and social assistance, social protection program, but we need to strengthen these social safety net for climate risk management. And, we know that vulnerability to trafficking is enhanced because of climate change. But what we need is trafficking should be considered within the framing of social protection initiatives by providing access to basic services for all vulnerable households so that, with a rights-based approach, at least they will not be left defenseless when they are exposed to climate risk. They'll have a basic safety net around them. And they will not be pushed into pursuing risky coping mechanism or risky coping strategies that leads them to trafficking-like situation. And along with basic rights around social protection mechanism, we also need portability of these rights because here we are talking about people and households and communities being displaced, being forced to migrate. So if these entitlements remain with them when they are in a place and they don't move with them, then it's of no use. So we need portability of these social protection benefit as they move so that when they are in a destination place, they are still protected by them. And finally, I would say preventative measures are needed for advanced planning to relocate and resettle communities, especially we say this with the rapid sea level rise, there's so many small island development countries which are facing, like for them, displacement is inevitable. So for them, we need anticipatory action to move people to safety before a disaster strikes so that they're not exposed to the vulnerability of trafficking. And finally, before I stop, Samantha, I would say that in my research in that paper, we had called for action on this issue, and I'm happy that there's so many organizations now started to talk about it. But we had really highlighted the action that needs to be taken by entities like UN, by ILO, by World Bank, by national governments. And we would really want some coordinating entity like yourself to coordinate that action between different organizations and make sure that that call of action goes out and people make effort around them.
Yeah, thank you very much, Dr. Ritu. Some good concrete actions that can be taken by people, the different stakeholders involved in the response. They're all Well noted. I just want to remind people that please feel free to post any questions and comments on the chat. I'd now like to introduce Professor Claude Destré. He's a professor of international law and human rights at the Joseph Corbell School of International Studies at the University of Denver in the USA. So he woke up very early to be with us, and thank you very much for doing that. He founded and was director of the Human Trafficking Center during the period 2002 to 2021, and also the director of the Center for Human Rights Education in 2008 to 2021. He was a member of the team of experts who developed an international trafficking in persons and smuggling of migrants syllabus, and offered the first full course based on the UNODC Education for Justice, Trafficking in Persons modules, Trafficking in Persons and Smuggling of Migrants modules. His present research is on the interaction of climate change, climate refugees, and human trafficking, working with Indigenous, Maori, and Pacifica colleagues in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and applying the GIS geospatial analysis to human rights and climate change. Prof. Claude, thank you so much for joining us. So in your view, what role can the academia play in the trafficking in persons, smuggling of migrants, climate change thematic area?
So first, thanks very much. My thanks to Zoe, to Samantha, and the entire UNODC E4J team for organizing this sidebar event. I began my work on human trafficking in 1998. My position as supervisor of asset forfeiture at the U.S. Attorney's Office in Washington, D.C. made me aware of the issue of smuggling of migrants before we had the International Palermo Protocol or the U.S. Trafficking Victims Protection Act in 2000. In 2002, I left the U.S. Attorney's Office to join the Faculty of Law at the University of Denver and started what became the Human Trafficking Center. In 2004, I moved my professorship to the Joseph Corbell School of International Studies, where I am, and the Human Trafficking Center became the only two-year graduate level training program on forced labor and human trafficking in the US, and indeed in the world. What became quickly apparent was that there was a wide gap between the law enforcement side of human trafficking and research on human trafficking. The language, terms of art, and the definitions of the Palermo Protocol and the TVPA may have worked well for the criminalization and prosecution of human trafficking, but was inadequate for social science research. We had to create our own definitions based on usage in the literature so that we could be precise in our research. The 3 and then the 4 Ps of prevention, protection, prosecution, and partnership had 2 problems. The first 3 Ps of prevention, protection, and prosecution were, again, law enforcement and social services related. And the 4th, which is partnership, focused on the relationship between law enforcement and IOs, NGOs, and social services. None of these included academic institutions. The Human Trafficking Center, in response to the 4 Ps, proposed the 4 Cs. We called the causes, conditions, cures, and collaboration or cooperation. One cannot really speak about sex trafficking or labor trafficking worldwide. The causes and conditions of labor trafficking, for example, in the Indian subcontinent, will be dramatically different than that in Colombia, or in Iraq, or Germany, or the United States. That also means that the 3rd C, cures, will also be dramatically different. The 4th C, collaboration or cooperation, understanding, of course, that some see the word collaboration in negative terms, suggested to us the real need to bring in academic institutions on local, national, and international levels to work with government agencies, law and policy makers, law enforcement, IOs, and NGOs. Academic researchers bring a unique set of skills needed to understand the phenomena of trafficking in persons and smuggling of migrants, both in terms of the collecting and analysis of data, but also, maybe more importantly, in terms of systems critique. At their best, academics are mostly free from the constraints of politics and national policy. However, we did discover 2 worrisome phenomena. Colleagues who would normally be applying rigorous research methodology to the work were often overlaying their work with their own personal perspectives and conclusions especially as it pertains to sex trafficking. The very first thing I say to new students studying human trafficking is that while I don't want them to lose their passion, I want them to match it with intellectual rigor and integrity. On the government side, the most glaring example of questionable methodology for major studies rests with the annual U.S. Trafficking in Persons report. The page that describes its research methodology consists of 2 to 3 sentences that were, at best, vague. This would be considered completely unacceptable at any academic institution. Yet the U.S. TIP report has far-reaching influence and consequences. So the HTC, the Human Trafficking Center, decided to dedicate itself to producing reliable and transparent data that could be used by IOs, NGOs, and government agencies to help create rational law and policy. We also took it upon ourselves to scrutinize the methodologies others were using to research human trafficking. One major project that we continue to work on is the development of a human trafficking index that measures 127 plus variables. I am convinced that it is critical to support the collaborative effort with academic institutions. Some years ago, I had the opportunity to meet and discuss climate issues with President Mary Robinson. This was a moment of really great clarification for me. Not only did I start teaching a course on climate justice, but I wanted to further explore the relationship between climate change and human rights in general, and more specifically, the impact on climate refugees and human trafficking. I realized that climate change was the big tent under which refugees, migrant smuggling, and human trafficking would dramatically increase. And it didn't seem like anyone was really addressing the issue of the intersection and the multiplying effect of climate change on human trafficking. I also realized I needed a new set of skills to look at the problem. As Samantha noted, I started studying GIS, Geographic Information Systems, or science, and applying geospatial analysis to the issue of climate change, human rights, climate refugees, and TIPSUM. I was able then to take my sabbatical in 2019 and go to Aotearoa, New Zealand, at the University of Otago in Dunedin and work with the Center for Sustainability. The South Pacific seemed a perfect setting to study the effects of climate change and climate mobility. I presumed that I would be working with the New Zealand government and its ministries. I quickly realized that I really needed to work with my Indigenous Maori and Pacifica colleagues to deeply understand the scope of the problem and the complexity of the social issues. I'll be forever grateful not only for the warm welcome that Mino Cleverly, a Samoan leader and scholar researcher at the University of Otago, gave me and my wife, but his introduction to me of Indigenous research methodology. I came to appreciate not only the depth and rigor of Indigenous research methodologies, but also that it offered an important and legitimate alternative analysis and understanding of climate change and its consequences. I now know that applying Indigenous research methodologies is critical to our understanding of the phenomena and can give us possible scenarios for adaptation. Unfortunately, like everyone else, the coronavirus pandemic put everything on hold, but I'm planning on returning to Aotearoa, New Zealand to continue my work next academic year. And given the severe constraints on research because of the pandemic, upon my return to the University of Denver, I asked my colleagues at the Human Trafficking Center to conceive of an exploratory report on the intersection of climate change and human trafficking. The result was the May 2021 report entitled Vulnerability Multiplied, the Nexus of Climate Change and Human Trafficking, which UNODC has kindly uploaded to its Sherlock resource site. The report focuses on a number of case studies targeting populations that were already vulnerable. In Central Asia, the rural villagers of the Aral Basin. In Europe, the European Romani population. In Latin America, the indigenous peoples of Venezuela. In the Middle East and North Africa, the Palestinians under Israeli occupation. In North America, the Native America, First Nations, and Inuit communities of the Arctic. In Oceania, the fishing industry workers of the Pacific Islands. In Southeast Asia, the Rohingya refugees of Bangladesh. And in West Africa, the rural communities of West Africa. I hope this report will be a contribution to the nascent discussion between climate change and human trafficking, and I certainly welcome your comments and critiques. My thanks again to the great UNODC E4J team, to my colleagues, of course, on the panel today, and to all of you for deciding to tune in to the presentations. We are in the middle of a climate emergency. This will be the work of many hands, many areas of expertise, and many worldviews. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Claude. You've also covered, I think, the issue of the emerging issues that are, which I was going to ask next, on the emerging issues arising in academic thought on the field. So I'll just move to our final presenter, AKM Masood. He is the Executive Director, Integrated Community and Industrial Development Initiative in Bangladesh. He has worked on migration and human trafficking for the last 18 years as a researcher, planner, public policy advocate. He's one of the 3 founding members, founding executive directors of Incident Bangladesh, which is a leading national research and advocacy organization in Bangladesh. Along with his research experience, he has worked on national policies and has drafted national action plans in Bangladesh, such as the National Action Plan to Combat Human Trafficking. His work has a strong focus on the rights of migrant workers. Mr. Masood, thank you very much for joining us today, right at the end of your day in Bangladesh, I imagine. So in the Bangladesh context, how has climate change affected trafficking in persons, trends, and patterns?
Thank you. Let me thank UNODC for this opportunity and the panelists for bringing in such diverse and invaluable inputs to the process. First of all, if you look at Bangladesh, you would see that there is this urgency among the people to move out. This is not just in a bad way. People are moving out because they are exploring livelihood in the overseas situation. Bangladesh is one of the leading countries of sending migrant workers, and that's good for the nation. It's one of the top remittance earning comes from migration. Why am I telling all that? Because migration has become a prominent strategy for a country like Bangladesh. This means that a culture of mobility has been promoted. I was listening to my fellow panelists, and I understand fully that this kind of mobility will come handy when we talk about climate change. Now, mobility has a dark side, and that's where trafficking comes in. Look at Bangladesh. I mean, we're going through a pandemic, and World Bank had to readjust its economic growth index because they predicted that Bangladesh will be having a growth of economic growth at 5.3% between 21st and 22nd. But it seems that it's going to bypass even that. It's more than 6% that we're going to experience. That's good. Why is that then on the index of people crossing the Mediterranean towards Europe? Last year, Bangladesh topped the chart. Yeah, and then when just last month, there were 7 dead Bangladeshis floating on a boat on the sea towards Europe, heading nowhere. That's a puzzle, a dichotomy. And that's what brings me to this panel with a different thought. Now imagine a world where desperation drives. Desperation because you don't understand what's changing, but you look at your economy and you can feel that, day by day, agriculture is losing its importance. You don't understand with all your traditional skills the crop cycle anymore. You can't predict monsoon, which is a driving force for our agriculture. And you experience high salinity, and it's on the rise. Now, all that can be linked with man-made disaster of false irrigation projects, overuse of fertilizer, and even the dams and embankments that we have constructed. These can be local. At the same time, when you go to people like our panelists, with a climate change background, she would promptly answer, this is not a local phenomenon. It has a bigger story and it lies within the framework of climate change. Now that's scary because you can fix the local problems yourself. But when it's a global venture of destruction, you're just a tiny part in the process. Specifically for a country like Bangladesh with so little global voice, while taking a toll at a magnitude which is bigger than anyone else. Because just like some of the islands that we are so familiar with, Bangladesh is another land which can really suffer due to the rise of sea level. We are still, as we speak, we are in suffering because, of the slow changes. The salinity is a critical point, and then comes the flood. The global reports on average annual displacement shows that Bangladesh is having a displacement largely due to flood, and this flooding has increased. And this melting of Himalaya, that the whole situation of sea being risen, being a delta, we are in between the mountain and the sea, nowhere to run. Yeah, so we are caught in this climate, and climate change has played this game changer within this framework of migration that we are, currently exploring as a strategy of development. So when you talk about displacement, migration, being drawn within the development strategy, Bangladesh is on top. We are doing that, yeah. But where are we getting stuck within this change in climate? Let me say that climate change, as I have explained, is not an information that goes to the communities I'm talking about. It's an experience that they have with an intimate realization. The habitat, the resource base that they were familiar with are no longer adequate in meeting their future needs. Now, migration is all about climbing the social ladder. People had this dream that we go out, we earn, and we invest in the local economy because I want to get back. Well, if you are a working person who migrated abroad, you don't have a choice but to return under the strict labor migration regime that we experience. So everyone wanted to come back, but come back richer. They wanted to invest in the economy of their local region, and that's how migration helped to boom the economy. What we are experiencing now, the data that we have on mobility has this strange connotation. It's saying that the middle class is contributing more than 80% of the annual displacement, the upper and lower middle class combined. So these are not have-nots. We are talking about people with something, yeah? So why are they interested to move out? I know I'm giving you a lot of perspective from a land you hardly know. But imagine this, that you wanted to build a house in your village with the earning of your migration. And you wanted to believe that building a house will not be the end. You will invest in agriculture, and that would help the family to move up in the social ladder. Now, suddenly you realize that investing in agriculture is not a good idea. And then you don't have the skills and education to get into the urban centers and make a headway. You can always do that, but that's a displacement, not really a managed migration, because what livelihood opportunities are there within the urban centers that would help you to grow further is not clear to them. Here comes the game-changing factor of climate change. As I said, not an information, but an experience to the communities, and they want to jump the ship. And now these people floating in the middle of Mediterranean were the first of these families to change their citizenship, because it's no longer than an identity holding a future. And that's where climate change brings a global recognition of a crime called trafficking. Because the dream sellers on the ground poses as smugglers who can bend the rules of migration and take you anywhere, but they leave you dry, rather wet on the sea. And that's where the criminals are making money out of the misery and urgency of the people. I'm not selling fear. I'm telling you that global leaders would have to learn that adapting to climate change has its limitation. There has to be a global regime of managed migration, not within the borders of countries, but better management of climate impacts upon population across the globe. I wouldn't build further on your patience. Rather, I would leave it here saying that tomorrow can be better if this change is not for fear. Rather, we come together and realize that global governance has to make change because the planet cannot sustain the way we manage our resources and the way we manage humanity at present. Back to you. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Mr. Masood. That was very insightful about just the perspective on the ground, and also just thanks to all the panelists. I'm sure we have a lot of food for thought now. We have received some comments on the chat, questions and comments on the chat, and we'll get into those. But let's start by giving the floor to Ms. Kathy Unlu, who is the Senior Coordinator for Intergovernmental Affairs at USJTIP. She just has a few thoughts to share with us.
Thank you very much. Thank you to UNODC and to all of the panelists this morning. I should say this morning here in Washington, D.C., for bringing to light these emerging issues that intersect with human trafficking and smuggling of migrants. This event on the intersection, this nexus that we've been discussing, has been very informative. As we learn more about the effects of climate change on populations, we agree it will have a significant negative effect, specifically, as you have said, on displaced and marginalized groups, making them immeasurably vulnerable to exploitation. This nexus between climate change and human trafficking is something that my office, the State Department's Office to Monitor and Combat Trafficking in Persons, is looking at more closely. We funded research by Verite on intersections of trafficking in persons, vulnerability, and environmental degradation in forestry, where we learned that some victims are coerced into participation in criminal activities, such as illegal logging. Verite noted that stakeholders from companies, government, and civil society organizations have an important role to play to protect victims of forced labor and labor exploitation. And now we are beginning discussions on this with other donors, and through our program to end modern slavery, I am very pleased to announce that we currently have a notice of funding opportunity soliciting statements of interest to fund research and implementation projects in 5 priority areas, one of which is on climate change and displacement. For interested applicants, please go to grants.gov or grants.gov to learn more about this funding opportunity. With that, I'd like to actually maybe introduce a new theme in my question about the green technology industry, which, as we know, faces the challenge of forced labor in its supply chains. In the endeavor of bringing about a just transition to clean energy, are there opportunities to simultaneously counter climate change and accelerate solutions to the challenges the private sector has faced in its supply chains for decades? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that contribution. So I will now turn to the panelists. Any initial reactions, and also maybe I'll also throw in there the question from Zenia Mejia about what your thoughts are regarding the different labels used for this phenomenon: climate change, induced migration, environmental refugees, displacement, and what the implications of those will be. I don't know, Dr. Rita, can I give this one to you? Okay.
Yes, I was almost raising my hand, and I have to thank all the fellow panelists. I was really enthused to hear Professor Claude and Masood Bhai, especially because we have done so much of case study development, and Bangladesh has always featured because of its vulnerability. And before so one thing that Masood Bhai really raised was there's a limit to which we can adapt to climate change. And increasingly, that's defined as loss and damage. So, we are crossing the limits to which we can really cope with this. And we recently compiled 12 case studies, and it's not just the issue of Bangladesh. We compiled 12 case studies across different regions globally and different types of climate impacts, right from slow onset event to rapid onset event. And one common feature across all those 12 case study locations was forced migration and distress migration and displacement. So this is an issue which is going to become increasingly important. I also saw one of the questions which said, somebody mentioned that is there only going to be internal displacement or is it going to be cross-border? So you can't really contain, as Mr. Masood was saying, you can't really contain this migration, especially coming from India. And I know within the Sundarbans, the cross-border migration has been happening for ages. Now, because of climate impact, it's becoming inevitable. Like places are getting more and more eroded. There is erosion and it's becoming inhabitable. So it will increase. Now, going back to that labeling, yes, within at least as a researcher, I would say the Cancun adaptation, COP16 identified 3 different types of mobility. One is migration, displacement, and planned relocation. And I would say, I would not go into defining them as climate refugees or, but I would really say that if these 3 distinctions are good enough for us to at least distinguish, because each of these 3, migration, displacement, and planned relocation, they speak to different types of mobility patterns and they have different implications, policy implications. So, if we can frame our policy responses within that framework, it would be useful. And I think Professor Claude has something to add, so I'll just stop there and let him come in.
Yes, please go ahead, Prof. Claude.
So I also noted that question about the different terms of art, and I just want to say, Mike, when I went to New Zealand, one of the things that I went with the term climate refugees. I was telling my colleagues I was going to be studying the phenomenon of climate refugees in the South Pacific, and my Maori and Pacific students, colleagues, objected to the terminology immediately as making them into second-class citizens and degrading. So then we started talking a bit about climate migration, and then I went up to Wellington to talk to the Crown, to the New Zealand government ministries, and they hated the term climate migration because it sparked controversial political issues dealing with security and everything else, notes that quite frankly they had picked up from the United States. So the term of art that they were using, that they agreed upon as something neutral, was climate mobility, which meant nothing to me, quite frankly. It was such a neutral term, but it was a non-descriptive term. So the term climate refugees has problems with it, but it's a term of art that we have used a lot. And maybe, again, it's one of the kinds of things that academic institutions can do, is to try to break down these different terms of art and how it's being used in the literature, because perhaps they actually, while there's overlap, they also may be very distinct terms that we can look at in separate sensibilities. But I have to admit, I was fascinated right up front that when I got to the University of Otago, the immediate backlash from my indigenous colleagues to even the term climate refugees, and I couldn't use the term in my conversations with them, though it sparked fascinating discussions.
Thank you for that. Prof. Mulali, would you like to respond to any of the questions that were raised about the terminology, but also on whether climate change leads to more of internal or international migration? Someone also asked about youth, what the role of youth can be in the response. If you have any thoughts you'd like to share.
In relation to internal or international migration, I think it leads to both. And as Ritu said, we have a whole range of forms of mobility. And I think the critical thing is that we address the risks of trafficking arising from climate change in both internal displacement settings and in the context of international migration. So the Global Protection Cluster has been doing very good work on looking at links between human trafficking and internal displacements, and we need to do more in the context of international migration, up to the International Migration Review Forum, and linking. As I said in the chat, I think getting caught up in terminology like climate refugees can lead to obstacles around whether you fit the legal definition or not. And the key thing really is expanding safe, regular pathways to migration and ensuring the rights of migrants to prevent trafficking. The environmental degradation that is happening in sectors where we also see forced labour. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Masood, do you have any thoughts on the questions that were asked, or maybe something on maybe what the youth can do? I think that's the one that has not been addressed yet, like the role of young people. We've heard of them as a vulnerable group, but they could also be part of the solution somehow.
Yeah. I certainly believe that they are part of the solution, and some of the areas I would like to bring it back to trafficking at the same time, because we can discuss climate change broadly, and we can talk about mobility and migration as well. But what about trafficking? Why it's unique from other forms of mobility? Because there is this profit and exploitation attached to it. There is this whole demand side of trafficking, which also capitalizes this urgency triggered by climate change to exploit cheap labor. Let's not forget that that's the dynamics where the young people are subjected. You know, the migrants that we talk about, the traffickers use, are also targeting them. So looking at them as a part of the solution, you need to understand that which youth you're talking about. The youth which is fighting for a livelihood abroad, they have a different perspective on it. And I think that young people across the globe will have to have a space to discuss further, understand each other, understand the challenges posed by the generation who created this trouble, how they can cope with it better, manage the world better, and move ahead. I strongly believe that a floor opening is needed at global level for the young people to come together and discuss and take up a new challenge, not for just for them, for all of us, because we have created something which we cannot handle at the moment. And human traffickers, I would like to say that there's this whole issue of smuggling in migrants that's been played these days more frequently to recruit their victims. So when we are talking about discourses on climate and mobility, I strongly agree with the professors that when he says that this whole identity of refugee creating, disempowerment, identity of voiceless, identity of passiveness, that's been refuted by the young people everywhere. So we need to understand that there is this fight for empowerment as well. And sometimes this, whole change of citizenship proposed by the smugglers help to recruit the young people because they don't see that they can be empowered with their identity in future. So I find that, I'm tricking you in bringing my own issues on the table, no matter what you ask me. But I think that these are all relevant when you talk about young people, because if you don't understand why they are getting into this desperation, why the traffickers are selling the old stories and recruiting more these days, because the uncertainty under which young people look at future, we need to change that together. Creating a vibrant vision for future is essential if we want to counter the darkness triggered by climate change. Back to you.
Thank you. Ritu, I see your hand is up. 1 minute left if you just...
Yes,
yeah.
absolutely. Because you talked about youth, and I forgot to mention about it. We are working with Youth Coalition on Loss and Damage, a very active network across a range of countries. And they're doing some fantastic work around creating awareness around loss and damage related to climate change, and also helping us generate evidence from the ground so that it can be used to influence policymakers to take action in that area. So, I do see a role for youth, and that there are many ways in which they can support this action.
Thank you very much, everybody, and special thanks to our panelists for joining us despite your busy schedules and across the various time zones. There's a lot of very engaging discussion on the chat. It's rich with information, and I've been following it. I hope you've been following it too, and many links to key resources that have been referred to today. So please go ahead and have a look at that. And thank you very much to you all once again. Have a good rest of your day. Take care.